Hey folks, so in this video we're going to take a look at an ethical theory called Kantianism. So Kantianism was developed by a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. So Kant I primarily know as the author of a book called Critique of Pure Reason, which is probably the most impenetrable book I've ever tried to read. If you're ever bored, you can go and look it up at a library or something. So basically, Kant's general idea, is that people, are supposed to act according to some moral rules or moral laws, and these moral laws should be universal, They should always be in play. Now, for us, one of the reasons we're going to look at Kantianism is because it's something that basically we can do reasoning on, So there should be kind of a path to say, okay, this is why something is right? So we'll introduce this basic rule called the categorical imperative, and it's something we can basically build on, So if we're faced with a scenario, we have a way to say, okay, starting from essentially first principles. I'm using air quotes there. It's not really the right terminology. We can get to being able to say, oh, is this act moral under Kantianism or not? All right, so it's very nice from just the standpoint of something we can actually reason on. So first, kind of a general note. So one thing that Kant talks about is this notion of goodwill. And so he's kind of concerned with this idea of what does it mean for something to be good, or what is good, And there may be a lot of things we can think about. We could think about maybe certain attributes or certain characteristics of people as being good, Or maybe certain things or acts as being good. But one thing that Kant basically proposed is the only thing that really is good at the end of the day, is goodwill. That's the only thing that's in and of itself can be considered good. Because anything else you could have somehow, it could be used for some other other use, that is maybe not good, So from his perspective, the only thing that is unequivocally good, is goodwill itself. And so the thought here, the bullet point here, is really to say, okay, the point, of being a kind of a reasoning agent, I know he uses this term a few times, reasoning agent, is basically to cultivate the desire to do the right thing. I'm reading from the slides there for a second. More specifically, one of the things that Kant mentions is this idea of dutifulness, So as an agent, you should have some moral laws, that you are trying to follow along with. So if you're following some moral laws, the hope is that you can kind of judge the moral value of an action based on how it aligns with that rule. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is going to be something called So let's now take a look at kind of the overall rule that Kant proposed. So this is what we call the categorical imperative. So let me break down the name of it real quick. So first of all, we're saying categorical. This is basically saying this is supposed to be universal, So this is going to be kind of our moral law, that is always in effect, There's also an idea of a hypothetical, There is maybe a rule, that only applies in certain scenarios. For this, what we're saying is this is going to always be valid, second part there is imperative, So this is kind of a command, this is the way you're supposed to act, So this is roughly speaking, in the categorical imperative, in the words, what we're trying to say is this is the way you should always act, okay? And we're going to actually look at two formulations of it. They in theory, say the same thing. According to Kant, they say the same thing, although I think it's kind of still debated are they equivalent or not. So let's take a look at this first formulation. Act only from moral rules you can at the same time will to be universal moral laws, So this is basically we have this idea here, that our kind of our sense of morality, comes from things that are universal, if I want to know if an act is moral or not, it shouldn't just be for me, It should be something that's true for everyone, It should be a universal law. So let's take a look at an example. So, okay, so let's say we have this following question, Can a person in dire straits make a promise with the intention of breaking it later, So this is something, this is maybe a scenario, And we want to know, is this a moral act under Kantianism or not? Well, the first thing we'll do is basically say, okay, from that I need to have some sort of a rule, I need to have some sort of a moral rule, whereby I could evaluate that question and judge is it moral or not. And so this rule, is what I essentially want to do the equivalent of almost like proving, I want to basically be able to justify it, from the categorical imperative. So the rule I'm going to try and justify is the following. I may make promises with the intention of breaking them later. Okay, so that's what we want to show. So the hope is, if you have a rule like that, well, the person, that's in this kind of dire straits, is able to make a promise, they will be believed, and then hopefully they can, get on with their life, whatever, and then, later break it. So that's hopefully what we would want to get, if we want to show this question is indeed a moral act under Kantianism. Now, via the categorical imperative, the idea there, is that things have to be universal. So this rule will kind of restructure a little bit to say that anyone, can make or break a promise, So it's kind of a general thing, It's not just me, It's not just this person, in this particular scenario, but anybody can do that. Well, here, what happens is we get an issue. If you're allowed, basically, to make and break promises, anytime, at will, well, then all of a sudden you don't really have the idea of promises anymore, right? You can't make a promise because no one would believe you anymore, right? There's no such thing as a promise. And so in this case, right, you've kind of contradicted the rule, right? So if the rule is true, right, if it's okay to break a promise, well, then anybody would break a promise. Promises have no value. And if promises have no value, nobody makes promises, and therefore your rule isn't needed, right? Because your rules depend on you needing to basically make a promise. But if it were to exist, right, promises themselves wouldn't exist. And so you have a contradiction there, right? You have kind of the existence of this being true, right? Or I should say the idea of this being a moral act, right, contradicts the fact that it can be a moral act, right? Therefore, it's not, right? So because it's not going to hold, as a universal rule, we can't say that this is going to be, a moral law, right, under Kantianism's categorical imperative. And so the answer to our first question, right, ends up being no. Now, another way to think about this, and we'll actually go into this in a little bit more detail, is basically look at, well, it's kind of another sense of making these things universal. So here we're actually saying, and you can, I guess, glance down for a little bit, but we have kind of the same scenario where I'm saying, I want to be able to make promises and with the intention of breaking it later. The idea that here, right, is somehow that, in general, right, people should make promises, they should have to keep them, but I want to be the one that's allowed to break them. Now, when you say something like that, you're basically privileging yourself, right? You're singling yourself out as a special case. Well, a special case, right, isn't exactly universal, right? So you're kind of contradicting the idea of that categorical imperative, right? It's no longer something that's just, it's no longer something that's a universal rule, right? It's something that's specific to you. Therefore, it does not follow from that, that formulation, right? You're not following from that categorical imperative. So let's suppose you're looking at some scenario and you want to know, is this something that probably is going to be, a moral act under Kantianism? Well, kind of a quick check, right, is basically say, okay, hey, if other people are allowed to do this, is it okay, right? Would I have an issue, right, if somebody else were to follow this rule, right, and act in a certain way, right? Now, if you have some doubts about that, right, if it doesn't feel right to you, right, well then maybe that's kind of an indication that you are actually breaking the categorical imperative, right? Because again, the idea is that when you have some of these statement, right, that says that people should be allowed to act a certain way, it must apply to everybody, not just to you, right, but to everybody else. And so if you have an issue with somebody else acting like that, well, then maybe that's a sign, right, that it's not, actually valid, right, that maybe this isn't, a moral act under Kantianism. So let's take a look at another formulation of the categorical imperative. And again, right, the idea is that, at least according to Kant, these things are equivalent, although, I think it's still kind of debated among philosophers. So let me just read this. Act so that you treat both yourself and other people as ends in themselves and never as means to an end. Now, this is a little bit, maybe somehow, a little hard to unravel. What he's somehow saying here, right, is that you want to treat people, right, as rational agents, right, as things that can reason, right, as as people, I suppose, right, rather than saying, this person, right, I'm only treating them, right, as an end, right, so I want to do something, right, and so this person enables that, right. We're trying to say that's not okay, right. Rather, we want to say that we should treat people, right, as if they are reasoning agents, right, that have their own goals or whatever, right? They have their own rights. So the note here in the slides, I've left this unedited from the book, is that the second formulation, some people find it easier to work with, right, when trying to show that something's moral or not under Kantianism. They find it to be easier than the first rule. For me, actually, I like the first rule more because that idea of finding something that's self-contradictory is kind of very natural to me. Either of these, right, we just kind of assume that they are equivalent, right? So if we want to know whether a particular scenario, right, is moral under Kantianism, right, we have to basically construct our statement, right, and then either we can use the first formulation or the second formulation to show is that moral or not, right? So either one is fair game. So let's take a look at a little scenario. So this is the plagiarism scenario. So in here we have basically our main agent, right, our main reasoner, Carla. So Carla is a student, single mother, works full time, taking 2 courses. And she's, taking some history class, right? And this history class has, a writing requirement, right? You have to have 4 papers, right? And, partway through the semester, right, she's done, several of these papers, right, gotten good grades on them. But she's finally, at the end of the semester, right, and there's a final report that's due, and, she doesn't really have time to complete it. And so what she does is she purchases a report, right? She goes online, to the websites where you can, have somebody write your paper for you, and basically buys one, right, and turns it in, submits it as her own work. So imagine that as a scenario. Okay, so the question is, right, is this a moral act under Kantianism or not? So let's take a look at this basically from both formulations of the categorical imperative, right, and see kind of where we go. So the first one, right, this is the first formulation. So what we're saying, right, is that, Carla, right, has submitted this work, right, claimed it as her own, right, and she wants, somehow to get, credit, right, for this report, right, goes to her grade, gets her, her degree. And so here, right, what we do, right, is we first have to formulate, what is the rule we want to show? What is the rule statement that basically, lets us judge, is this thing moral or not? So the rule here, right, I'll read this. You may claim credit for work performed by somebody else, right? So that's the rule. Now here, right, this is the first formulation, right? And the first formulation is all about, is this thing universal or not, right? Can it apply to everybody? So the idea here, right, is that if this was a moral act, right, then this rule, right, you may claim credit for work performed by somebody else, right, would apply to everybody. But if that was the case, right, then everybody can turn in work that's not theirs, right? Every single person that's doing this assignment could turn in something that's not theirs. But then all of a sudden, right, that kind of assignment, right, isn't worth anything, right, has no value, right? In which case, that assignment would no longer be given because it no longer measures the student's abilities, right? No longer measures how much they've learned. In that case, right, you all of a sudden in a world where nothing is assigned, and if you have something that was assigned to you, well, then you don't have the opportunity to turn in something that was plagiarized, right? That's not yours, right? And so we have that again, that self-contradictory nature, right? Where if the rule was to hold, then there would be no need for the rule to exist, right? And because it's kind of self-contradictory, right, we're going to say that it's not a moral act, right? So it would be wrong, for Carla to turn in this report that's not actually hers. Okay, so that's again the first formulation. Let's now take a look at this from the second formulation. So again, Carlos submitted, work that's not hers. The idea here, right, in the second formulation was basically to say, okay, is Carla treating somebody else, right, as basically a means to an end, right, rather than an end in and of themselves, right? And so basically what we said is that saying that, is she, right, is somebody, right, treating somebody else, right, as their own, reasoning agent, right? Somebody has kind of rights, has the ability to reason. So here, right, in this kind of formulation, we're saying, okay, Carla basically has deceived her professor, right? So rather than treating her professor as somebody that can be reasoned with, right, somebody she can go talk to and say, hey, I need an extension, what can I, there's some sort of, something that prevents me from getting this done. Rather than that, what she's doing is basically saying, okay, I am going to kind of, deceive the professor just because at the end of the day, that's the way that I get, a passing grade in my course, right? So she's kind of ignoring the fact that the professor, right, has, somehow rights, right? Is in fact, right, an agent, right, that should be reasoned with, right? It's not just a producer of grades, right? They can stamp on your degree at the end of the day. And because she's not doing that, right, because she's not treating the professor, right, as a reasoning agent, well, then you're basically violating, right, this second formulation, and so your overall scenario again, right, is again not moral under Kantianism, right, because you're kind of privileging yourself, right. Again, there's this sense, right, of everything should be kind of equal, right, or universal. So here, right, Carla's treating herself as being somehow a more important reasoning agent than the professor, right, that she's deceiving. Because of that kind of inequality, again, the second formulation doesn't hold, right, and so again we find that what she did is not a moral act under Kantianism. Now that we've talked about the two formulations of the categorical imperative, let's talk about the cases both for and against Kantianism. So first, the cases for. And I'll kind of read through these. A couple of them are kind of the same. So the first one, right, is treats all persons as moral equals, right? And so you kind of got that kind of flavor, right, from both of those formulations, right? So in the first case, we're saying that rules must be rules. So moral rules must be universal, right? The second one, we're saying that hey, everybody needs to be treated, as an equal, right, as a moral agent, right? So we kind of have that sense of equality. Second bullet point here, right, is gives all people moral worth as a rational, autonomous being. So basically, it's saying, you think of the second formulation, basically, right, everybody kind of has rights, right? They're all, reasoning agents, right? They're all reasoning beings. We're not privileging one person over another. Third, which is really kind of to me similar to the first, is holds everybody the same standard, right? So again, everybody is equals. They're equals in terms of they're moral equals, right? They're equals in terms of they all have the ability to reason, right? They're all being held to the same standard. And the last one there, right, produces universal moral guidelines. Basically, what it's saying is that Kantianism is maybe nice. Because the rules it produces are universal, right? So they're not specific. They are, right, not supposed to be specific, to a time or a place, right? Which hopefully has, well, may have, I should say, a little bit of intuition there, right? Is that if we want something to be a moral rule that we follow, it should have some sort of sense of globalness, right? It shouldn't be a special case. It should be something that is holds for everybody or every time, every place. Okay, so let's move along to basically the cases against Kantianism. So the first thing I want to actually mention before we get there is kind of this notion of duties again, right? So we initially said at the very beginning, people, right, have kind of the duties, right, to follow, right, these moral laws, right, and if they perform some sort of action, right, we can judge the moral value of that action based on how it kind of aligns with those moral laws. So there's this notion of duty. So there's okay, so there's two ideas here, right? One is of perfect duties and one's of imperfect duties. So a perfect duty is basically something you always need to obey, right? So you maybe do something like you always tell the truth, right? Or you never steal, right? These are things, right, that are always, you always have to follow. And then, right, we have this idea of an imperfect duty. And an imperfect duty is basically something that you don't always have to do. You should do it, right, but you don't always have to. Maybe there's some sort of an edge case somewhere. Well, maybe we talk about that in a second. One sort of an edge case maybe is maybe when it conflicts with a perfect duty, right? So you can think of this maybe as being two sorts of priorities, right? Something that always has to occur, and then something that else, right, that it will occur if something that's perfect isn't required. So that, right, there's an example there is helping others, right? So maybe there's a case where you could help somebody, right, but in so, right, maybe you do some other harm, right, that outweighs with the good that you're doing. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? Perfect versus imperfect duties, right? Things you always must do versus things you will almost always have to do, but not every time. So what are the issues of Kantianism? First issue, right, is basically this idea of finding these rules, right? And so for the scenarios we talked about, we could basically come up with a single rule. Okay, that's great, right? And we're able to judge it easily. The problem is that when you get more complicated things, you may need, somehow you may need multiple rules, right? There may be no single rule, right, that categorizes the entire situation, right? No single statement, right, that you could judge according to the categorical imperative and then be able to figure out, is this thing a moral act or not? Well, if you don't have just one rule, right? If you have maybe multiple rules, right, or maybe you can't even formulate rules, which is a bigger issue. Well, say you have multiple rules, right? That's maybe something we could hope to deal with. What we have issues with somehow in Kantianism is a sense of the perfect versus imperfect duties. Because what happens if you have, this scenario, right? You require two rules to kind of evaluate it, but both those rules boil down to something that's a perfect duty. Well, there's no real way in Kantianism to resolve that conflict, right? Those things both have kind of the same priority, and so which one wins? There's no real answer to that. Now, if you have a perfect and imperfect, the imperfect, right, will by definition will yield to the perfect one, right? But the problem is, right, if we have two of them that are both perfect, we don't know which one to follow. Third bullet point there, right, is again this idea of a perfect duty, right? Something you're always supposed to do. This maybe gets us into trouble sometimes, right? So we maybe have scenarios where, for example, the one of the examples we gave of a perfect rule, right, is always telling the truth. We could get into a situation, right, where maybe there's this, it would be better for us, right, to tell, a lie, right, a white lie, just to avoid, something else happening, right, some sort of, argument or whatever, right, and it's something really minor. Well, in Kantianism, we don't really have a way to do that, right? If it's something that's a perfect duty, like always telling the truth, then it's something that's always to be obeyed, right? And we have no flexibility, which is maybe an issue, right? If we think in terms of, well, I need to actually quantify real world scenarios. This isn't just about this idealized problems, right? We want to deal with real world stuff as well. Okay, so overall, right, there's kind of some issues here, right, with kind of these, once we formulate the rules, right, how they may be conflict with one another. But for us at least, right, Kantianism is going to be interesting. We are going to talk about it because we have basically a way to do some reasoning, right? So if we're presented with a scenario, right, we have to basically, figure out what is the statement of the rule, right, that would let us judge whether or not it's a moral act underneath Kantianism. And then based on that, right, we can basically say, hey, we can take a look at those two formulations and say, hey, does this, rule that I came up with, does it follow one of those formulations, right? So there should be some sort of a reasoning process we can use there, right, in order to evaluate, our analysis, right? To say, yes, I agree, right, this is indeed a moral act under Kantianism because I can see, this is how it was derived from that categorical imperative. Or maybe I can see, hey, there's a flaw in the reasoning, therefore it's not. And so that's why we're going to treat this as a workable theory because we do have the ability to evaluate kind of the correctness, air quotes there, of a particular answer, right, whether an act is supposed to be moral or not under Kantianism. We can judge that, so it is useful for us.